Hello everyone, I welcome you back to another important lecture. And for today's class, we would say the major phenomenons that are the part of the sexual reproduction in plants. And in that, we will try to look on toward the process of the pollination and the fertilization that happens within them. Now you see that in the previous class, I gave you a very clear idea of that in the flower we have the male and the female parts, and I took you to a situation where we identified the various part. Now, since the sexual reproduction is involving the male and the female part, so overall, what we looked previously that this filament and the anther they make the male part of the plant, and at the same time this stigma, the style, the ovary that we have, the ovule that we have. So this makes the female part of the flower. The issue here is that the male gamete that we have got, this is lying within the anther, within their pollen grains, and the female gamete that we have got, that is a female nucleus. So this lies within the ovule. So you see is that the positioning of the male and the female gamete within the flower is at different location. So for the fusion of the male and the female gametes, what we require to be doing at this point is the pollination. And by the pollination, what we simply mean is that this would involve the transfer of the pollen grain from the anther to these stigmas, and we know that stigma is a part of the female part of the flower that is carpel with us. So if I take you toward understanding the meaning of the term pollination, before that, as I have highlighted, that we need to see on the issue. And the issue is that the male gamete, as I have highlighted in the diagram, and the female gamete, they lie in the different part of the flower. And for the fertilization process, we require to be transferring the pollen grains from the anther to the stigmas so that later the fertilization can be brought about by. So that is why the pollination would be happening. And that is simply the transfer of the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of the flower. Further, what we have to be seeing is that how many types of the pollinations we have got. So, the pollination falls into two distinct categories. On one side, the pollination would be the self-pollination, and on the other hand, the pollination that we have got. So, this would be the cross-pollination with us. It would be better that we look on the diagram to understand that what difference do we have for the self and the cross-pollination. So, if you see, we have got this diagram with you. And just assume is that this plant, which is shown on my left hand side, and this plant, which is shown on my right hand side, so these are the plants of the same species, right? So if I were to just go here, so you see that this is the flower that I have got. So if the pollen grain would transfer from the anther to the stigmas of the same flower on the same plant, so this would be the self-pollination, right? At the same time, if we were to assume that if I have got this flower and I have got this flower, so again, these are two different flowers, but they are there on the same plant, and by some mean, if the pollen grain would fall from the anther of one flower to the stigma of a different flower, but on the same plant, so this would be self-pollination. The thing happening in the cross-pollination would be that here I have got one flower on this plant. Here I have got the flower which is there on the different plant but of the same species. So when the pollen grain would be transferred from the anther to the stigma of the different flower of the different plant but of the same species, So this would be the cross pollination with us. So if I were to summarize, if the pollen grain go from here to here, this is self-pollination. If they go from here to here, this is again the self-pollination. But if they are transferred from here to here, owing to the fact that we have two different plants, different flowers, but of the same species, so this would be cross-pollination. And here I am to be emphasizing on this point is that if the pollen grain from this flower, if they would fall to the flower of some different plant species, so ultimately the fertilization cannot be brought about by, because each of the plant they have their distinct number of the chromosomes in them. So now if I just teach you to be defining these terms as they are frequently asked in the exam. So the self-pollination, this is the transfer of the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or different flower but on the same plant. And if we were to bother about the cross-pollination, so this is the transfer of the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of different flower or different plant but of the same species. So this would be this cross-pollination with us. The other idea is that the examiner is very much interested that the student must know that what are the advantages and the disadvantages that we have got for the self and the cross pollination. So if we were to bother about the advantages of the self pollination, so the thing is that there would be less loss of energy, and by the less loss of energy what we mean is that there would be less loss of the pollen grains as this is happening within the same flower or happening on different flower but on the same plant. So it would be resulting in less loss of energy. And this is more time efficient because within the same flower and in different flower on the same plant, the transfer of the pollen grain would be fast. So this is more time efficient. And again, we are not in the need of any pollinator, like we do not need any of the insects. Likewise, if we were to talk about the disadvantages, so there would be less genetic variations. Since this is happening in a flower or within the flower on the same plant, so less genetic combinations would be brought about by in the resulting seeds or the plants that would emerge out of it. Now, since there are less of the genetic variations, so as a result of that, any of the offsprings that would be produced post pollination and the fertilization phenomenon, so they would have less beneficial characteristics in them. And as a consequence of that, if there is some environmental change, so they are more susceptible to them or they would be more affected by them. Like if I were to say that there are some temperature changes, if there is some change in the water content of the soil or nutrient content in the soil, if this changes, so they would be more impacted. And at the same time, they are more susceptible to be attacked by the pathogens as well, and they have a greater chance of catching the diseases. Moving onward, if I were to be talking about the cross pollination, so the advantages of this would be that there would be more genetic variations. The offspring that would be produced later after cross pollination and the fertilization, they would have more of the beneficial characteristics in them, and they are less susceptible or they are less prone to any of the environmental changes or by any attack that would be brought about by the pathogens. If I were to talk about the disadvantages, so there is more loss of energy in terms of the loss of the pollen grains. This is less time efficient. The reason is I am transferring the pollen grain from one flower to a different flower on a different plant, but of the same species, and I am relying on toward the pollinator, so it would take more time. And at the same time, there is necessity of the pollinator as well, so that they can do these plants a favor of transferring their pollen grain from one plant to another plant, but again of the same species. Moving onward, since the pollination has happened, now would come a situation where the fertilization has to be brought about by. Now, since in a flower we have the male part and we have the female part, so the male part, which overall is referred to as a stamen, and in that we have the anther. So over there, the male gamete would be produced. And within the ovules that we have in the ovaries, which is further part of the carpel, so over there the female nucleus or the female gamete would be produced. So the fertilization simply is the fusion of the male gamete with the female gamete, and this would go with the name of the fertilization. If we were to talk about the human beings, so this would be the fusion of the sperm cell and the egg cell. But since the plants are concerned, so we would say that this is actually the fusion of the male nucleus, which is available within the pollen grain, with the female nucleus, and we know that it is available or present within the ovule that we have got in the ovaries. Now, the further thing is that why this fertilization is important. So you see as that since two parents are involved, no matter if they are lying within the same flower, but since we have the male part and the female part, so the offspring that we have to be producing as a result of this phenomenon, so this needs to have a diploid number of chromosomes. We need to maintain them within the zygote. So one set of the unpaired chromosome that would be available within the male nucleus that is within the pollen grain, and the other one set of the unpaired chromosome that would be available within the female nucleus and that is there in the ovule. So when they both would fuse, so we would maintain the diploid number of chromosomes. Now the thing is that where does the fertilization happens? So if I were to just take you back to the diagram of the flower, so you see is that we have the ovaries here, right? And in the ovaries, we have the ovule. So this is actually the ovaries where the fertilization would be happening for in case of the plants. Now, it is important that we must know the overall mechanism that how is this fertilization brought about by. So before I proceed, I'm just recalling it for one more time. This overall is the female part, which is carpel. Here we have the stigma. In between them, we have the style. Here, what we have are the ovaries. Within the ovaries, we have the ovule, and in ovule, we have this ovum that would have the female nucleus in it. And here, we have got an opening at this point, and that opening it would go with the name of micropyle. As a result of the pollination, the pollen grains they basically fall onto the stigmas, and we would see later in a while that how come this fertilization phenomenon is actually occurring. So you just have to follow it. That first, the pollen grains that we have brought from the anther, and they have the male nucleus in them, so they would land on toward the stigma of the flower. The unique thing with the stigma is that this is sticky because there is production of some sugary excretion, so that would cause these pollen grains to remain adhered here at this point. The issue with the pollen grain is that it cannot overall travel downward. This would only be the male nucleus that we have in the pollen grain. They need to go down, ultimately fusing with the female nucleus. So the thing happening at this point is that some enzymes would be released, and these enzymes they would digest some part of the style so that we can make a passage. And that passage that we are making, this is a pollen tube, and this pollen tube would begin to grow downward into the style. So the pollen tube is actually carrying this male nucleus, which was available within the pollen grain, and it would go downward, and ultimately this pollen tube would enter the ovule through an opening, and that opening, this is micropyle with us. Now later, the thing happening is that within the ovaries, the male nucleus and the female nucleus, they would fuse with one another, and as a result of that, the fertilization would happen. Now the examiner would ask you that what are the post-fertilization events that okay fine the male and the female nucleus they have fused. So what would happen later? So you see, the petals, they have done their role. The sepals have done their role in terms of attracting the pollinators. In case of the insect pollinated flowers, so the petals that we have here and the sepals that we have here, so they would fall off. Okay. And the ovary that we have here that had the ovules where the fertilization has happened. So this ovary overall, this would become the fruit. And here, the ovule that we have, where by the fusion of the male and the female gamete, we have made the zygote. So the zygote would do many mitotic divisions, and as a result of that, we would make the seed out of it. So this is important. So you just need to be having a look now that in the post-fertilization events, the petals and the sepals they would fall off. The zygote that we made as a result of the fusion of the male and the female gamete, due to the mitosis, it would be converted into a tiny plant that would be the embryo. The ovule, it would convert into the seed, and the ovary that we have got, this would be making the fruit, and we know the fruit would have the seed in it. Moving onward, at the end, what we have to be understanding is that the dispersal of the seed within the fruit is very important. And the usual situation is that since the fruits they have the seeds in them, and in the seeds we have the young plant, which is the embryo with us, so they have to be carried away from the parent plant. And this can be done when the birds or the animals would eat up the fruits, and the seeds they would not be digested within their digestive tract. So they would move to some distant place, and over there, when they would pass the feces, so the seeds would pass along with it. In some cases, as if I talk about the coconut plant, so they have this ability to float in the water, so they can be carried away with the help of the water away from the parent plant. Now, the advantages of this would be that there would be less competition among the parents for resources. Like if I were to be considering a situation where we have a parent plant that has produced fruit and having the seeds in it, and they fall to the same place, and the new plants, if they would emerge out of it or they would grow out of it, so they would create a lot of competition for their parent plant for the resources like water and the sunlight and the soil nutrients. But if we would carry them away and by the help of the seed dispersal phenomenon, so ultimately there would be less competition. And now the plants, since they would be finding the new places to grow, so that would be allowing them to be adapting to the new environments. So this was all in context of the pollination, the self and the cross, their advantages and the disadvantages, the fertilization and the post-fertilization events. So I hope this would be clear with all of you, and for the next class, we would look on toward the major phenomenon that is the seed germination.